Our second panelist is Mr. Satish Kumar. He is a Senior Vice President and Group Chief Officer at Intellect Design Arena Limited. Mr. Satish is an award-winning seasoned legal professional with 25 years experience of legal experience. He is currently the Senior Vice President and Group Chief Legal Officer at Intellectual Design Arena and is a keynote speaker in various international platforms and authors. He has received many awards and coveted Legal Counsel of the Year 2008 by INBA. His long and legal strides include working in prestigious MNCs like Ramco, HCL, Technologies, Polaris, etc. Ms. Karishma Bora is a barrister at 39 Essex Chamber in London. She has been in practice for about 14 years and has a busy cross-border practice focusing on high-value disputes before the commercial courts in London and DIFC court in Dubai. She specializes in technology, construction, private equity, and banking disputes. Mr. Karishma has the rare expertise of being dual qualified in India and England, making her an attractive choice for matters involving either or both jurisdictions. She is ranked in the Legal 500 Middle East under Brand 1 and in Legal 500 UK as a leading individual for commercial dispute resolution. I welcome all the panelists. Over to you, Adarsh. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vandana. Thank you, CII, for inviting us, and also Adarsh for very tirelessly putting all of the speakers and the agenda for today together. I realize that we're running quite out of time, so jumping straight in, I think it would be useful to explain first off what ERP software solutions are. And I'd like to invite Satish ji, if you could perhaps do the honors. Before you do, maybe I can just very simply explain that it's a software that automates processes, and those processes can be either in the field of finance or human resources, such as payroll and employee processes, or operations and logistics. And ERP softwares can either be bespoke, so customized for the client, or they can be standard. And Satish ji, if you can tell us a bit about the different types of ERP systems, and from your experience as a person and a high-ranking legal officer in a company that provided ERP software solutions, whether you found that the clients cooperated in implementing this software.
Yeah, thanks, Karishma, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I hope I am audible, right, Karishma?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so Karishma, you have very nicely explained about what the ERP software is. The main theme of the ERP, what you have to understand is there are various business processes in any organization. It can be accounting, it can be procurement, project management, risk, and even various departments, supply chain management. So it is an integrated management. It is very critical. It is an integrated management of all the departments in real time. So one is various department, another is integrated management in real time. So these are the critical aspects. So when we manage all the department in real time, that software is called as ERP software. And coming to, there are various ERP software. You have brought it very nicely, whether it can be a bespoke software, it can be it can be a already existing software which you can license it, or which you can host it in cloud. So there could always be a conflict. You have brought in the topic of the conflict. The conflict could be because of sometimes overselling the ERP software. Sometimes, sometimes it can be for the scope creep that happens in the software. Once we start implementing the software, ERP software, there could be a scenario where there can be multiple scope creep. Customer keeps on, increasing the benchmark, So once they increase the benchmark, or once they increase the scope of the work, the vendors, the software vendors also keep on, adopting to it. So, there are various flashpoints between, the customer and the vendors. So this is where, usually a difference of opinion arises. So the customer always states that, this is part of the scope, and the vendor's company always states that this is a scope creep, or this is outside the scope, and you need to enter into a change request, or yes, additional purchase order has to be given. So this is where various flashpoints or the disputes arises, and there are also disputes of over licensing. So you give a license for X number. So there are various. I will leave for others to speak. Maybe I'll come back and again explain, because I have seen this in very close quarters. I have seen the ERP disputes in very close quarters. So I exactly know when to plug in the dispute, where the flashpoints are. So, Karishma, I'll leave for you and Arpinder to take it forward, and then maybe if time permits, I'll speak again. Karishma.
Sure. Just before we do that, would you like to give us, you have previously worked in a company that distributed and licensed out HR software. So if you can tell us, for example, what that software did. I think you also have experience of aviation ERP software. If you can tell us a little bit about that, and construction ERP software.
Yeah. So see, as mentioned, the ERP software can be for the various industry. It can be for a construction industry. It can be for a HR software. When we are talking of HR software, it is across all the industry. Whether it can be for the construction, it can be for the HR, because you process payroll. So what happens? A global ERP company usually licenses or maybe gives it on a SaaS model, which is on the hosted cloud model, to a corporate in various parts of the geo. So what happens in HR model is there are various statutory obligation when you calculate a salary for an employee. Sometimes a tax deduction has to happen, the loans have to be deducted, advance has to be given. I know various calculation happens when you are processing a HR software. So all this and it is all unique for each of the geo. In India, there is a TDS. In other geography, there will be something else. So, as a HRP, as a ERP software, or sometimes you also call it as a HRP software, that is human resource professional. So, as a ERP or a HRP software, this software has to encompass or to identify all the requirement in a particular geography, so as to encapsulate and give out the correct calculation and share it with the employer, so that he can run the payroll and pay the salary. And all this, remember, all this has to happen real time, live, in a very short duration. It's not that you will have a luxury of time, 15 days to process the salary. No, it has to happen. Usually the details are sent to you or sent for processing on the last 2-3 days, and all this has to happen in maybe in 24 hours. There is no time frame that you work within only 8 hours, 10 hours. It has to happen within, say, 24 hours, so that the end results can be given to the employer. So
Thank you.
Yeah, Karishma, maybe you can take it forward. Yeah.
Thank you, Satishji. I think, Arpinder, just before I call on you, it would be useful to give from an English law perspective what the duty to cooperate between the parties are. Now, in a case before the High Court in London in 2000, so about 21 years ago, His Honor Judge Tomlin said that there is an implied duty to cooperate between the supplier of the ERP or HRP system, as Satish has just put out, and the client. And this is because, first of all, the client needs to say what exactly their needs are. The supplier has to say whether those needs can be met, and perhaps Arpinder will come in to say what happens when a software provider overpitches and says, yes, we can meet these needs, but perhaps they can't. The next step that the judge laid out was that the supplier then has to take, after successfully installing the ERP software, the supplier has to take steps to train the client, and the client also has to be willing to accept the training, has to deploy the personnel, has to make the time for this training, and so on. So there's a great deal of cooperation that is required, and I think an analogy can also be drawn with a pure construction law principle, which is the prevention principle. Very simply, if, for example, a landowner does not make a piece of land available, a developer cannot construct on it. And there is an implied duty, which goes back in English law to 1881 in the case of McKay and Dick, that if a contract requires parties to do something that requires them to do it together, there is an implied term on both parts that this must be done. So with that duty to cooperate in mind, Arpinder, if I may call on you perhaps to take us through your experiences of ERP disputes, starting perhaps with misrepresentation claims.
Sure. Thanks, Karishma, and thanks to CII for inviting me. So I'll just start with some of the misrepresentations I've personally seen and been a part of as an expert. So one of the top ones is CVs, as basic as that. So I'll make it a little bit more simple for everyone to understand. The biggest issues I see are CVs. You pitch for a big implementation, whether it's in India or outside India. You're a big IT company, and then you say these people are going to be helping you implement the particular ERP. Because actually, sometimes the issue is not with the ERP, but it's with the implementation of the ERP, as mentioned by Satish. The question is, you say, "Oh, I've got these fantastic certifications." You oversell yourself, and then the project doesn't go as well. Then everyone, it's always about looking back, right? Whenever there's a dispute. So when you look back, you realize, oh, all the CVs were made up. They were overstated. The people didn't have those credentials. They were not fully trained. Automatically, that becomes the center of the dispute. It's as basic as that. And I've seen many disputes happen around just CVs. And that's a good excuse for the company to say, you misrepresented to us, and that is why our whole implementation has failed. The ERP is not working for us. Sometimes the impacts can be quite material. If you look up, there are many global companies which have lost 8 to 10% of their share value just because they couldn't invoice for 5 days, or they couldn't pay payrolls for a week. It's as basic as that. And the ERP fails, and then you start doing the whole dispute management around that. Second thing which I want to see as a dispute or misrepresentation, timelines. You commit to certain timelines, and then you don't track it properly. There is very little communication between you and the client. The timelines get exceeded. The company again loses revenue or efficiency. Let's say as Satish correctly said, there's a lot of ERPs. One could be around supply chain, which could lead to cost reductions. Now, that ERP is not in place, they could say, hey, we lost 2 years of cost reduction because of the delay in implementing that particular ERP. Now the question comes back into what was committed at the beginning, who led to the delay, all the communication, as you know best, Karishma. Unfortunately, what I've seen in actual disputes, the communication is so poor. So I think that's one thing, at least I can recommend. I see it much better outside India, where they document everything. There's more trust basis. When a ERP company or an implementation partner engages with a customer, they have proper documentation. This is what we agreed. It's very detailed. Every time there's a slight delay on either side, it's documented. Unfortunately, when I've seen it in India, it's all trust based, and that's where the disputes further end up. The CIO knows the implementation partner well. Everything is rosy till things blow up. When the CEO is really upset and the revenues got missed, ERP implementation has not been done on time, then they come back and all the trust basis goes down, and you're stuck with the communication which is not there. Who said what, and that leads to further issues. Another thing is deliverables. You sell the moon. This is going to save costs. It's going to increase your profitability. You need to get rid of 100 people because the ERP is going to make it so efficient. You're going to raise invoices in 2 seconds. Your supply chain gets updated in 5 minutes. Your inventory is fully updated. All sorts of things I've seen in real life, and unfortunately, you're overselling, and that's a big fundamental mistake, because that's again all documented and becomes a part of a dispute at a later date. Because even if the ERP is working, maybe the CEO or the owner of a company wants the moon, and you're kind of giving him like basic stuff which may be working, but it's not what you sold at the beginning. Another issue is trainings, like was mentioned. The biggest issue we see with most ERPs is the training is not proper. So another 2 years takes in understanding the system. understanding the different functionalities. Whenever frauds, I'm a forensic practitioner, the biggest issue we find is audit logs are never turned on. Then the company after 2 years says, who didn't tell you to put on the audit log? They say, oh, the ERP company never told us to put the audit logs in. But we don't have audit logs. Now we don't know who done the fraud. And that's all through the ERP now. Who should be blamed for it? Nowadays, you have fintech companies, right? So ERP becomes even more critical because fintech companies actually financial transactions. So that is a different type of ERP, right? Because you're actually doing financial transactions through it. And banks have very large core banking solutions. But the new fintech companies are all based on ERPs and different disjointed systems, and there the disputes will add up further. And I think they will add up further in the future. One more area I would say, which we see a lot of disputes, is cost. You know, you come in, you want to win the pitch, you're competing with 5 players, you give a cost which is 10, and your actual cost ends up at 100, and you do cost change orders, and that again becomes an issue because you oversold yourself when actually the actual project should have been significantly bigger. So I can continue, I don't want to take all the time, Karishma, but there are hundreds of scenarios. ERP, I think in the future, considering everyone has pivoted towards ERP systems, I think this will be something we need to keep our eye out from a dispute perspective. Happy to talk about remediations and how evidence is collected, but if you would like to add something before I continue on that.
Sure, maybe Satish, I can bring you in to give your experience on excess usage. I think from what Arpinder says, three main areas of dispute have emerged. The first is overselling. So that's misrepresentation. I mean, the software provider makes a representation, it's incorrect, and therefore they can be pulled up. The second is excess usage and licensing, and I think Satish, you have a lot of experience with that. So if you can, come in on that. And the third is basically just delay or a defect in the system. So these are the three heads that Arpinder has very kindly sort of put out there. And Satish, if you can expand a little bit and we can go back to Arpinder on evidence.
Yeah, very nicely put in by Arpinder, Karishma. So I can talk about the second one that you brought about the licensing, or where usually the revenue leakage happens for the vendor. So it has to be very carefully seen that when a license is given by, say, vendor company, and when in construction industry you take license from the vendors, you have to be very careful exactly about how much licenses you are opting for. So, for instance, most of the vendor companies, they are smart enough not to put a cap. So in other words, what I mean is, in the document, in the contracts, it will be mentioned about, say, 1 lakh users. But actually, usually we, as say, users of this software, we will say that, once we reach the threshold limit of 1 lakh, there should be a cap. I should not be able to use more than 1 lakh. But no, you have to be very careful that the vendors usually they do not cap it at 1 lakh. So you will be able to use it even more than 1 lakh, but they will be maintaining the count. So if at any point of time the total number of users exceeds 1 lakh, so that is it. So because here in this case you are given a 1 lakh cap, and this was agreed in the document. If in any part of during the term of the agreement or contract term, so it exceeds that limit, then it's a revenue leakage for the vendor companies. So you have to be very careful while you draft the contract, saying that the vendor should not allow you. The vendor should not allow you to use more than 1 lakh. See, that is something that you have to be very careful while you draft the contract, so that this dispute area is plugged. This excess revenue usage is plugged. Or to be safer, you take an enterprise-wide license. Of course, if it is commercially feasible, you can opt for an enterprise-wide license where there is no restriction on the number of users. So in terms of licensing deal or in terms of SaaS model, when it is hosted in the cloud, you have to be very careful that when you are negotiating with the client, the number of users are very upfront, finalized. And
Defined.
defined very clearly. And the vendor should not allow you to use more than that. This is something that, as a construction industry, you should take care. And the third one that I would like to talk about is about the implementation milestones. There are various milestones and payments attached to it. So when we opt for any of this software from the vendors, we should ensure that there is a very clear-cut definition of what a milestone is and how much payment will be released. Mind it, on acceptance of milestone, on UAT acceptance of milestone, user acceptance test, that is defined as UAT, user acceptance test of the milestone. It should not happen that the vendor claims that he has completed the UAT and he will charge you for that milestone, and you don't pay the amount because you feel that the milestone has not been achieved. A flashpoint is here. So that is where the dispute arises. You have to be very careful. Implementation stage is usually for a period of 9 months or 10 months, or whatever you agree upfront. Any LD that you agree has to be very clearly defined, and so that if there is any overshot of the timeline, you will be able to charge the LD to the vendor. So all these are some of the areas that that should be very carefully crafted, I will say, in a agreement. So I will use the word crafted. That is very critical. That is what you need to do, Karishma.
Thank you, Satish. I think Adarsh, I hope you're sitting there thinking that there are a lot of analogies to be drawn between an ERP dispute and a pure construction dispute. And I think I'd like to also just recall what Vishal Narula said earlier today, which is that there's just no getting away from technology, and therefore this session has been included in a pure construction disputes conference. But
Right.
taking forward, Satish, sorry, Adarsh, come in.
No, sorry, go ahead. I'll ask my questions, 2 questions at very last once you're finished.
Adarsh is known for that.
So just coming back, or rather taking forward from what Satish said, I think it emerges basically there is a need to define the number or type of users, and there can be concurrent users, for example 1 lakh users concurrently, or there can be 1 lakh individual named users. And in a high court case in 2017, which is a rather famous case of the famous software system SAP. So in SAP and Diageo, what had happened is that there was a named user defined ERP system. And then a few years on, Diageo decided to give its customers access to an app where they could then manage and place their own orders, rather than going through the named users of the ERP software that Diageo had bought from SAP. What happened with this? SAP came in and said, no, hang on. We had named users. Look at the agreement, and only these named users can use the ERP software. If you are allowing your customers to access it, even if it's through an app, that's a breach. That is excess usage, and therefore you need to pay us £54 million, no less. And the English High Court actually upheld that. And the English High Court says, well, yes, there was excess usage because of the definition that it was the definition of the users that were named users. Now, had they been concurrent users, for example, just 50,000 users or something like that, maybe Diageo would not have found themselves in a situation that they did find themselves in. So excess usage and excess licensing is certainly something that that one needs to be careful about and look out for when drafting their agreements. And Arpinder, if I may, come to you on evidence and gathering evidence, since you and Adarsh are both expert, forensic experts, and maybe you can draw on your experience of providing evidence or gathering evidence in ERP disputes.
Sure, thanks, Karish. So I think I'll start with the construction ERP system. So we were doing a dispute once, which was involved primarily actually. So it decides the timelines. You can manage your projects, timelines, and a lot of you online would know about that being a construction dispute seminar. But the fact is that what was the issue was there was an incident, and the fact that the question was on actually the instance of Primavera. So for instance, that was the basis of the dispute. That means what was the timeline committed to at the beginning of the period as mentioned in the contract, was linked to the Primavera, which said these are the timelines, this is what is agreed. Then the tracking was done, the customer was given access to the system, And the actual dispute ended up being, is this the right version of the Primavera? That means, have they actually done a fraud? And there are two versions of the Primavera, one which the customer was seeing, and then there was another version which the company was handling. So it became as technical as that around Primavera. So I would say on construction disputes, we should also be careful, not just on licensing, but also the usage of an ERP system to deliver a construction contract. Because when you're using an ERP system to deliver a construction contract, the data in the ERP system and the evidence in the ERP system also becomes critical. So I'm just wanted to highlight that for the purpose of the fact that this is a construction dispute. That is a very interesting case. I think going forward, most disputes and fraud cases will have versions of ERP and data from ERP being presented as discovery as a part of an arbitration. And that may become a different aspect, which is going to go become something of the future. That's one. Number two, coming to your issue about licenses, that's very critical and very technical. The point about, it's a common dispute with ERP companies where someone's using an app, it doesn't have a named user, and you have thousands and thousands of customers and millions of customers, as you said, in millions of dollars. That is again something which, as Satish said, you have to really be crafty in the way you look at your contract, sign a standard contract with a software provider or an ERP provider, because you will go into a hole. You have to read it very properly. You have to have a very good, experienced ERP lawyer who can actually understand the terms, because it's very technical about number of users, even concurrent users, which is a little different, which talks about actually parallel users. That means you have actually, five people using the same user ID. It's as basic as that. So, and which is different from people approaching from an app and getting access to an ERP. So I think there are different models of dispute, and from an evidence perspective, what we do is we actually get a full mapping of the users. We send technical people into a company. We go directly into a company server. We pull data directly from a company server to make sure which logins are there, which user IDs are there. It leads to many disputes. Actually, I remember in my previous firm, I was actually sued also because we entered a company, they gave us access, and then subsequently they said we had forced ourselves in. So this becomes a very contentious environment to collect evidence. So you have to make sure the ERP company has to make sure the agreement has a very strong right to audit clause. I'm sure Satish will be aware of that, working for a IT company. The right to audit clause is extremely important, because that's the only way you can collect evidence. You can't, if you don't have that evidence, then it's just hearsay. I'll give a very simple example. Long time back, there was an issue that this company has 10,000 employees, but they've only bought 2 licenses. How the hell can they buy 2 licenses for sending emails when they have 10,000 emails that they talk about all the time? So that was a very famous case. But I'm just saying that is also it's another way of checking, right? The ERP that you have 100 users, but actually you have 10,000. Then the company's biggest defense is, oh, we only had 10 people using it. We didn't have our 10,000 people using it, because different types of ERPs different people would have access. So the only way to collect evidence is have direct access to a server, because getting supplementary information and relying on it for a court proceeding or even an arbitration proceeding, I don't think will pass muster, because chain of custody, collecting evidence in a strong ERP dispute is extremely critical. The second part I'd like to talk about, this is on the license part. Even people use crack software. So every ERP system, sometimes people actually buy pirated software. So you can actually buy pirated software. You may have genuine software in 10 machines and have non-genuine software in another 10 machines. I'm not talking about the big software companies. I'm talking about smaller ERP systems, the mid-sized companies, or smaller size companies. That becomes a big issue. How do you detect this piracy? So with cloud, I think it's all reduced. Because I think the cloud has helped reduce some bit of this piracy and some bit of the basic license abuse, but it still happens in smaller companies, maybe not in the larger and mid-sized companies out there. So I think evidence is extremely important. Karishma, if I can just, I'll come back. I had 5 or 6 recommendations for companies on what they should be careful of to avoid disputes and make sure that they have the right information, so that tomorrow, if there is a dispute, you have enough evidence. That's extremely critical. And for some reason, I still find companies don't keep proper audit trails, what's happened during the process of implementation. It would really help them to do that. But back to you, Karishma, in the interest of time, and happy to add more.
Arpinder, why don't you take that forward, because we're nearing a close. So if you can.
Yeah. So in closure for me, I think what is very important is, I mentioned earlier, trust. I think there is nothing called trust. as Satish said, the contract which is signed initially has to be very well thought of. He used the word drafty. I really liked it. I mean, it has to be very well documented. You have to have an engineer, lawyer looking at the contract to understand user IDs, named users, concurrent users. He or she should be very aware of what they are signing up for, timelines, costs, the communication with the party. There should not be any side deals. All of that should be properly captured in the contract. That's number one. After you have a very smart contract in place, any smart ERP company or a client on the other side has to track all communication. If there is a delay, you have to document it. Letters, emails, there has to be more. The more evidence you have, the better it is. I always feel because that helps in a dispute at the end to show intent. It shows that the company had right intent. It was sharing an issue. There was a delay potentially from the company side, or it was a delay from the ERP side, or they could be any third angle of the implementation partner. So that's very important. Third is, I think the fact is you shouldn't lie. So you shouldn't oversell yourself. I think if you have certain people, if you have certain timelines, if you have a certain cost estimate, ERP projects are always going to go over. I've never seen an ERP project stay within budget, to be very honest. There are always change orders. Yeah, I'm sure there are exceptions, but you have to be very realistic upfront, especially in today's day, which I find is more litigious around ERP than it used to be in the past. So over to you, Karishma.
Thanks, Arpinder. And before Adarsh, I come back to you, just one point arising out of what Arpinder has said is the integrity of the evidence and the need to have solid evidence on servers, on clouds, etc. But Arpinder, there are, as there always are, gaps and cracks that one can fall within. So there was one particular construction arbitration actually that I did, and if it were maybe 20 years ago, it would purely be a dispute about the shortage of steel that was provided and why there was a shortage of steel, etc. But it didn't revolve around that. In fact, it boiled down to when there was a changeover between Oracle to SAP, were the users of the ERP system able to manipulate the data that was being changed over from Oracle to SAP? I mean, it was, and evidence became so crucial, but in that, the evidence unfortunately was no longer, the evidence that was on the servers or on the ERP systems. And this was a mega Indian conglomerate, but it was much more about the integrity of the individuals who are changing the system over. So there are all sorts, but the point is very well taken that there needs to be a proper documentation, and there needs to be data with integrity that one can rely upon and look back upon. Adarsh, with that, we're happy to conclude. Although I think we can expect a couple of questions from you as you have done for previous sessions.
Right. So thanks, Karishma. So just I want to ask one quick question from Mr. Arpinder. He has already spoken about the version control. There was a dispute related to the version of software. So we largely use the technology and the software, both SAP and SAP we use less, but we use mostly a project scheduling software like Primavera and Microsoft Projects, which is helping in delay analysis. So in particular contract, it is not written that which version you have to use. It is only written that analysis to be done in a Primavera or a program has to be submitted in the Primavera. So in that case, from the legal perspective, I would like to ask you as well as Mr. Arpinder also, is there any such kind of dispute? Have you ever came across whether dispute has been arisen because of the version control of the Primavera? Something like that?
Yeah.
If it is not a part of the contracts, yes, exclusively not written in the contract.
So Adarsh, I'll add one thing. When I said version, I mean there were two copies of the Primavera. There was a copy which had certain data with certain timelines, and then there was another version of the same Primavera. I wasn't talking about different 1.0, 2.0. I wasn't referring to that. I was referring to two copies. One had different data, one had different data, to the point which Karishma was saying. If somebody had given a version of Primavera which had data and certain timelines, it wasn't a different model or a different version of the software. So sorry for the misunderstanding, but it was a different
No
topic.
problem. Understood.
But Adarsh, maybe, I would like to add to your query. See, basically, there are two things in a contract when now I started using the word crafting. When you craft a contract, especially it is updates and upgrades, Adarsh. So if the customers are in the support services or in the AMC, then usually the vendors usually give the updates free of cost when you are in the support services. But the vendors are very careful that they don't give you an upgrade. So if you are in 1.02 version and there is a version change because there is an upgrade to the next level, say 2.02 version or something of that sort, then it is not part of the contract. It is not part of the contract. The vendors are very, they are more well versed in the ERP contract because they have decades of experience in it. So they exactly know where the disputes arises. So they are very careful to ensure that the upgrades are not given without any cost. But we as customers should ensure that we take appropriate help from ERP lawyers who are very well experienced from ERP, crafting of the contracts, so that they can equally, negotiate with the vendors. So we should ensure that when we are negotiating the contract, we should also get the upgrades because we are in the support service and we pay, say, for example, 20% of the license fee. So when we are paying 20% of the license fee, we should also get the upgrades. That is, if you are in 1.02, you should get 2.02. And if from 2.02 to 3.02, as long as you are in the support services. So this is very critical when you are, crafting the contract, Adarsh. I hope I have answered your query.
Yeah, thank you, Satish. And one very quick questions. Actually, I do not have. I have not handled too many ERP disputes in construction industries. As we understood that there are various types of ERP software is being used in, for example, like BAM, SAP, Oracle, etc. So, is there any particular data or analysis that are particular software platform having more issues? That is the question number one. And question number two, just I want to ask, being an expert, we use ERP software and scheduling software like Primavera, Microsoft projects. And sometimes it requires integration of the both software because the material management issue is dealt by the ERP software and the scheduling is dealt by the Primavera software. So do you feel that there is a more possibility of emerging disputes because of the nitty-gritty of technical integration issues?
I will answer your second part quickly because that is the easier one, and I will leave the first part because that is tough one to Arpinder. So, so answering to the second part, there should always be a integration as a customer. You should always ensure that there is a integration between the legacy system and the new ERP software that you are buying. If the legacy system is Microsoft scheduling or project, and you are buying a new software or a new ERP software, there should be integration between. This should be part of your implementation plan. This is a very highly disputable area. I can quote n number of instances where halfway through the line, as Arpinder said, no ERP contracts has ever been completed in the scheduled timeline. The timeline is 9 months, and there is already 12 months over, 15 months over, and there are instances because there are no integration or because of multiple reasons, the customer would prefer to go back to the legacy system. So they will, they had invested so much huge amount in ERP software, but despite that, they would rather go back to the legacy system because that is easier for them. And there could be a change in the management which will prefer to go back to the ERP. So there could be multiple reasons where if integration doesn't happen between the legacy system and the new ERP system, then you would like to go back to the legacy system, and this is a dispute arises. And to answer the first question, which is a better software like SAP, BAN, or I'll leave our learned friend Arpinder to answer to that.
Actually, I would get sued, as most of them are clients. So that's a tough question for Adarsh to answer. Which one is better? Maybe if he takes me out for coffee, I'll tell him. But not on a live video. But I'd like to just add one thing to what Satish ji said. Uh, I find Adarsh, you raised a very good question that yeah, about material management. In a construction dispute, that does come up very often. Because of the fact that how much material was issued on the site, how is steel, Karishma mentioned as an example, is being tracked. So that all through an ERP system does become an issue. Where is the staff? Why is there inventory shortage? Where is the capex, for instance? How is the movement of it being done? And then linking it back to Primavera or Microsoft projects or whichever software you may be using is very essential to make sure it stays online. So I think going forward, as people are using technology even more, as Karishma started this question, I think this ERP world will become far more critical for construction.
And a very last